All right. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. If so, someone could actually say something in the chat chat portion that I can be sure that the voice is coming through and my screen is coming through there. Just to be completely sure. So if someone would be so kind to actually confirm in the chat that you're seeing my screen and actually hearing my work. Great, thanks. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining for this session of the Frends webinar series. It's our first one after the summer vacations, and we are doing a little bit of a recap today of a webinar we actually had previously about publishing APIs using Frends and actually developing the backend for those APIs and basically the whole API management stack that ships with Frends. So including authorization, authentication, how to build logic inside the APIs, how to specify my API specification, how to manage the versioning of my APIs, and then actually publish them for usage using Frends. And today we're going to be looking at a couple of different scenarios. So first off, the idea is to actually have a brief recap, a couple of minutes on the actual architecture we're using within Frends to implement this API management functionality. And then we're going to be actually building a sample API from scratch, applying some authorization using an API key to that API, and go through a couple of maybe kind of pitfalls you might encounter while building APIs, and basically create this sort of a simple dummy API from scratch, so you can actually grasp the process and all the steps that go into publishing an API using Frends. And then we're going to be maybe taking 30 minutes to do that, and the rest 10 minutes that we have left, we're going to be dedicating to looking at a ready-made API solution I have prepared for us, which basically does some pretty cool things with the identity, and we're going to be looking at maybe utilizing OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect to actually provide authentication and authorization for our API, and then doing some pretty nifty stuff with the identity of actually curing data from a database. So to recap here a little bit, we're first going to be looking at the architecture, then building a dummy API from scratch, and then looking at a ready-made API solution, and maybe demonstrating some cool things that you can actually do with Frends within that context. But alrighty, let's just get started right on our way. So just a brief recap of the API architecture and the kind of API management functionality we have available here within Frends. So we are not going to be talking about that much of the kind of general architecture and the general integration capabilities of Frends, as we only have 1 hour. But to kind of get you on the right track, most of you probably know by now that we're utilizing what's called the agent architecture here within Frends. And the most important thing to understand is basically that what we're going to be doing here is going to be completely focused on the control panel or the control pane, where we're going to be doing all of our development regarding the API and all of our management regarding the APIs that we're building. But the actual APIs themselves are going to be hosted on an agent that's currently being hosted on our Azure cloud. And that's the place where the actual APIs will be published. So you might see me jumping between 2 different browser tabs here, one of them being the actual control panel where we do the development, and the other one being then the kind of API portal and the API catalog that's now being hosted on a different server or remotely in a cloud agent we have available. But pretty much the architecture inside the API is fairly simple. So all of the Frends agents that you have installed and attached to your kind of Frends environment have the capability of actually publishing and securing and executing APIs. So all of the functionality is present in all Frends agent installations, regardless of where those agents actually are. And the API management architecture and functionality within those agents can roughly be split into kind of 3 different main categories. So the first one, of course, is the kind of API gateway functionality. I'm sorry about that. For some reason, it keeps jumping to the next slide. Is the API gateway functionality, which is actually kind of the first gate that you have to pass in order to actually be able to call and consume the APIs. So the only purpose of basically the API gateway functionality is to provide the authorization and authentication management and the security aspect of when publishing an API. But if you pass that first sort of a gate or gateway on your request, so let's imagine you developing a front-end application on a web server, and I have been given let's say an API key to consume an API published by Frends. And if the API key is correct and matches an API rule set, we're going to be talking a little bit later about those API rules. But if it, for example, passes the API rule set we have put in place for that particular API, then the actual API call will go to the API engine or the kind of back end of the API. So this is going to be the actual Frends process that actually executes the desired functionality within that API and, for example, orchestrates the calls to the actual backend systems or data or microservices or whatever that we want to do within our API is then handled after the API gateway. And finally, of course, we have the kind of low-code mini services that most of you are probably familiar by now, which are then used to kind of provide the integration functionality within the API. So the configuration of, in a most simple case, it might just be a pass-through API where we just send the request as is to a backend system or service. But we, of course, can do a whole bunch of other cool things there, like the query database, combine data from multiple sources, do all sorts of validation, business logic, etc., etc. But the lowest layer is basically reserved for providing the technical connectivity to all the other different systems and components that we want to actually expose through the API that we're building. But basically, these three components are the ones that we're going to be meddling with today. So if we jump here over to our Frends installation, we're going to be using this salesdemo.frendsapp.com tenant for today's session. And don't be alarmed, there's a whole bunch of other cool APIs available here and a whole bunch of other processes that we are not going to be looking at today, as we're mostly going to be focusing on the APIs. But to kind of put things in context, to the kind of architecture that we just looked at, the kind of API gateway configuration or functionality is mostly done through the actual API's view within Frends. So that might mean that here we are applying different API rules or API access policies to our APIs. We are also defining how our API will actually look like, what's going to be the data within our API, what sort of different security options or authentication and authorization options do we want to apply for our API. And pretty much the kind of management portion for the APIs is going to be on the API's views. And then on the process side of things, this is going to be the middle layer in our architecture picture, where we'll actually be able to then define what the API or our backend of the API should be doing, how it should be connecting to different data sources or systems, and what's the logic behind executing that API. And then finally, the individual steps or pieces here within our kind of middle layer orchestration are going to be the ones that we use to technically configure and tell the different steps or different portions of the API that you should connect to, for example, towards this database, and use these sorts of parameters to query the database for data. So that's the three different kind of API components put into context here within the kind of Frends user interface. And pretty much what we're going to be doing next is just starting from scratch. So imagining that we have now, let's say, a need. So someone, for example, from a business side or wherever, comes over to you and says that, hey, I want now us to create this new API that, for example, just returns the current date. So let's not get too tricky here. So a simple API that just returns the current date for whatever purposes they might be using that. So the first thing you should be doing is either click the Create New button, which takes you now to basically a sample Swagger specification, or importing your own Swagger specification if you might have that ready or pre-built by some other project, or some system providers might have Swagger files prepared for their APIs for reflecting that API within Frends. And just to kind of give you a little bit of an understanding of what the Swagger or the Open API specification actually does, I would suggest that everyone checks out the Open API specification page or site here, the Open API initiative, which actually pretty much just lists the specification we're going to be using to tell our API what is going to be the different operations within our API, what's going to be the kind of descriptions and versioning of our API, what's going to be contained within our API authorization and authentication options, and especially the different data models that our API is either consuming or returning to the API consumers that call our API. And we're using the Open API specification. We're supporting currently versions 3 or basically versions 2 upwards, but everyone should be using the latest specification, which is the Open API specification version 3.0.2. And there's a whole bunch of different things here that tell you how you should form your API specification in order for it to be correct. And we're actually validating this quite heavily. So you need to be following that specification. So you can't just write basically whatever here, as that will immediately kind of bring you up with an error that you're doing something that's not according to the specification of the Open API specification we have there. And actually, I heard a weird noise there, but someone should let me know in chat if we lost the picture or lost the voice there. But pretty much the first step that we want to be doing is using the Open API specification information and how the specification will be used to create basically the spec for our API. And the spec will actually end up looking something like this, which will then also provide you with the option of testing out your APIs and communicating with your API consumers and developers in a kind of an industry standard way of how your API is supposed to be used and what it's supposed to be doing. And what we do here in Frends is provide you with kind of the bare minimum requirement of what you need to have in your API specification to actually make your first API. So in this bare minimum setup, what we're actually doing is just specifying that, okay, our API is called the new Swagger spec. It has a version of 0.0.1 and the description of actually nothing currently. And we are just telling that there's one API operation with the get method or the get HTTP method called new path, which doesn't take any parameters, returns nothing, and just says or just returns the description. Oh, description code 200 on a successful operation there. So our first step should be to actually now take this API specification and start modifying it in a way that we tell the specification what we want our API to actually do. So what I would be doing probably first is name our API, so give the title something descriptive, and actually it might be good practice to always have the word API in the title, so that then you can actually track everything pretty well within Frends. So if you include the word API in the title, that allows you to group up things a little bit better, but of course that's completely up to you, since that this is something that will be shown to everyone who actually consumes the API and will be able to view the API specification there. So let's just go ahead and I'm going to call my API let datetime API, just as simple as that. And I'm going to immediately bump up the first version number. Oh, you can go away. I'm going to immediately bump up the version number to 1.0.0 because I don't like versioning beginning from 0. So I always feel that the API versioning should at least be 1, unless you're doing something which is clearly in a beta or not supposed to be used in a production setting. And then I'm going to be just adding a simple description of our API, which will actually be displayed here. And you might be noticing that while we do our editing here, you can see the change being reflected in the kind of preview mode. So if I write my description to be, this is a simple API to, and just wait for a while, you can see that the change I applied to my specification here is now being rendered kind of in semi-real time to my actual API there on the left to provide my provide me with kind of a preview of what it's going to be looking like. But I keep on clicking things by accident, so we need to go back here a little bit. So let's call this my new or my date time API, do my version bumping here again, and say that this is a sample API to get the current date and time. And the next step I should be doing is configuring the base path. Now, the base path is actually quite important here, since what the base path will be actually defining is the end path, or the actual kind of first portion of the URL that my API will be consumed from. And why this is important is that you should always include a version number here in the base path, or you don't have to use a version number, but you need to use some sort of a unique identifier, because the base path is used now to differentiate between the actual APIs themselves. So what that actually means is that I'm able to take my base path and have the same API being hosted in two different base paths, or three different base paths at the same time. So that means that I could, if I'm now developing my API over time, I want to use my base path to, for example, increment the version to version 2 if there's a scenario that I make breaking changes to my API. And later on, we're going to be going through a little bit in detail what those breaking changes mean. But the base path is something that we're using to control which API versions are attached to which actually published API. And that actually means that if I were to take this API as an example, and for example, change my API specification in such a way that instead of product ID, I would be returning a field or a property called just pure ID. So if I do a change like that, that actually means that if someone else has hooked on or developed something on top of my API, and I change the way that my API behaves, especially regarding the parameters or the input basically for our API and the output for our API, that might break the basically application or the system that someone else is building on top of our API. So that's why we always need to be super careful that we are not doing breaking changes to the same API unless we are completely sure of what we are doing, and then should be kind of really clearly communicated that the change is now going to be taking place at this specific date and time, and so on. And we actually do this kind of automatically for you a little bit in Frends. So we detect those changes automatically. So if I were to take my current API here and do the change where the product ID changes to just ID, we actually display quite a hefty warning to you that, are you sure that you want to do this? And if so, you need to manually confirm that you know what you're doing, that you're kind of intentionally breaking the API for anyone who might be consuming that. But for now, let's just call our API date, and version 1 of the date API is going to be completely fine for us. Now, the kind of next thing that we can be doing, and I'm going to cheat here a little bit because I can't remember the specification by heart, as I would imagine no one actually does, is implementing what's called the kind of tags portion for the API specification. So the tags portion of the API specification basically is used to divide your API up into different bits and portions. So if I have a huge API, which might be called, let's assume it's called organization, I might have different categories within that organization. So I might have something like people, organization units. I might have something like, let's say, salaries. I might have something like properties. So all of these different kind of aspects of the same larger big picture. So that would be the kind of the organization API. I can divide or group those up using the tags functionality. And that's fairly straightforward. So I just name my kind of tag setting. So you will give the tags in basically just a list of these would be the tags that I want to use within my API. So I'm going to just call my tag here time API and tell it that it's actually API used to get the time. And that's it. So now what I want to be actually doing is defining the different API paths that I actually want to expose. So I have one path here defined for me as an example for the new path, which basically does absolutely nothing, but it's actually in many cases much more or much simpler to define or basically just copy paste an existing API path. So I have an existing API product for or path for the API product. So I just copy paste that here in our specification, and it's much easier to now just modify my existing specification to my needs than trying to write everything from scratch. But that's of course up to your preference on how do you want to do that, or how do you want to go about building your specification. So now if you remember that we defined our base path with the kind of description or the indicative of what this API is going to be about, and then we specified the version number that we can use to identify different versions of the same API. And now we should basically just define that after the base path, what should be the address where we call the API. So in this case, we have the product there kind of in place, but I'm going to replace the product with, let's say, get time as my path parameter there. And I need to specify the API operation. So you can see here that the get time of operation got the get HTTP method there. And I could just as easily go ahead and change that to, for example, post, or let's say post like that. And it's reflected there immediately that, okay, now instead of a get, we need to do post. And of course, all of these different options are supported. So you can have the options kind of category there. You can do put, you can do delete. All of this kind of familiar API operations are available for you to use there. And of course, that's something that you should go ahead and check out in this API specification to get the kind of complete big picture of what we want to do. But for now, for our example now, we just gonna be using the get method here. And now we can specify that our API, which has our existing tags specification above it, is something that we want to actually now tell our API operation of our get time using the get operation or the get method should belong to the group of the time API. So now that actually jumps here to kind of live under the time API grouping. And I could now, of course, introduce multiple different API operations under the same grouping here if I so desired. But then again, the kind of final things to do here to specify our API operation is to give it a little bit of a description. So again, we might do something like this API returns the current date and time, and we're fairly happy with it. We could also do kind of a longer description, since the summary is something that you see here with all the different APIs listed, and then the description is something that you could actually write kind of a decent documentation of what your API should be doing. So in many cases, it's just an expansion, or let's say a further clarification of our summary. But for our case, let's just use the same one that we have here for now. Now, the next step that we should be doing within our specification is actually defining the operation ID. So the operation ID is something that we are using within the API to actually distinguish between the API operations and make them unique. Since I might have a situation where I can have multiple different, let's say, operations on the same path, and I can even have same operations on the same path with different parameters. So the path cannot be actually used to uniquely identify the actual API operation. So that's why we need to tell or give the operation a unique ID And usually the best practice here is just to kind of combine what the API does in this sort of an understandable way. So I'm just going to go call this get date and time and be fairly happy with that. And we can tell the API that it produces application or application/JSON. So we're returning JSON from our API. And then the interesting bit here would be to specify what our API or what's going to be the actual data model that we're returning from our API. So what our API should be returning. And here, actually, there's a couple of different ways of doing it. You can do the specification here directly. So basically telling the API that this is going to be the kind of hard-coded values that you're always returning, or you can do what the example is doing here is actually referring to a schema within the API specification document. And what we're going to be doing the kind of definitions route here. So basically taking the API definition that we have here available and tweaking that to suit our need in basically in our case here. So we want to take our paths section there of the API and copy paste our definitions list there, which should contain now basically the data model. So you can see now that I copy pasted those over from the other API, we can get the kind of data model specification for each and every one of those APIs. And it's actually super important to do the definitions properly. So a proper definition, so I'm actually gonna get rid of this particular API or the product specification, and we're just gonna be modifying our product list here a little bit. So what we should be doing here is, of course, giving the kind of object some sort of a name. So I'm gonna name my object, let's call it date and time stamp. And why it's actually super important to specify my data model properly is that now the OpenAPI specification has the capability of actually providing kind of machine understandable description of the API. So there's a lot of different developer tools and environments that have toolkits of basically just giving a link to the API specification. So the actual kind of JSON description that we are creating here, and those different tools will then use the data models to provide or generate kind of ready-made code classes in, for example, front-end development or mobile development. So making sure that our data model has the correct data types, has the correct data formats, and even better if they have examples, because then those can be used to basically provide kind of a dummy response in many cases and help us along with our development journey a little bit. But pretty much after specifying that we want to have our data model called date and timestamp, we say that it's an object. It could also be an array or a list. The only thing we need to do is specify the different properties that our data model should have. So currently we have our product ID and product name. So let's get rid of our product name category there, and let's just call it date and time, quite simply. So pretty much what we're doing there is specifying that we have a simple data model that's returning an integer value, and actually that's wrong. Let's change our integer value to be not int, but actually string in this case. And we do have options for different date and time formatting for our date and time option there. But just as an example here, I'm not going to be using the actual format there at all, since we're going to be doing a little bit of magic with the date and time, and I don't want to be stuck with the specific validation that the OpenAPI specification gives us for date and time. So we can actually take a quick look here. So date type maybe. Well, we need to jump here a little bit, but pretty much we have the RFC 3339 specification for both of the date and date time, which are just a specific format in which you're supposed to communicate dates and times within the Open API specification framework here, but we're not going to be using those in our example here. So now I'm just going to give the kind of an example data. So say basically that when I'm returning data, it's going to be formatted and it's going to look something like this. So I'm just going to say that it's going to be 2019 and let's call it 08 and 27 and well, let's be happy with that for now. That this is the data, or this is what our data is going to be looking like when we return it from our API. So now pretty much the only thing we need to do, that we have our definition here ready, and you can see that it's giving me a warning that the definition is all right, it's okay, it's correct because it's being displayed to me here. But there's a warning that you're never using the definition. So I'm never using the date and timestamp in anywhere in my API. And that's because our current getTime API operation or path we just defined doesn't actually refer correctly back to our date and timestamp operation here. So what I need to be doing now is actually the first step could be that I just replace my product list placement there and specify that that's what our API should be returning. But there's a slight problem here still. So you can see that it's actually now returning an array instead of just the value that we provide at the API. And that's because we've specified that the response for our API should be of type array, but we have defined our definition to be an object. So we should change our type to also be an object, and then just refer back to our actual end result of our API. Or, but if we wanted to, we could keep it as an array, and there are multiple different options that we can do to actually provide our API in this case. But just as an example here, what we should be looking at now is kind of a ready specification that we could start working on. So what we have done there, to recap a little bit, is specify the kind of basic information. So what our API is going to be generally about, what's the current version going to be, what's the description going to be, the base path, host, tags that we might want to have our API. And then we did the definition. So we defined the data models that we want to return from our API, and then defined the operations which we actually then grouped within our tag that we created for our time API. And if we did everything correctly, what we could be doing now, because there are no validation errors, so nothing shows up as red, we can click Save Changes, and you should end up with my datetime API here on your API list, and basically have this as an example that as the base point for our development. So if you open up our Get My Datetime API here in our API view, we can see that we have the base path here, we have the same descriptions, we have the version that we gave the API, and we also have our API operation here for get, and we can have the same descriptions and titles that we have here. But there's nothing here, so there's just a button called Create New Linked Process. And what this actually does, it's informing us that there's no backend configured for this specific API. So what this actually means is that in order for us to have a functioning API, we need to click the Create New Linked Process button to start the development on the back end of the API. Since now we only have the API specification available, but we have no configuration of where those API calls should actually be going and what should actually happen in the back end of those APIs. So we should be good. Let's just go ahead and click the Create New Linked Process, which takes you now to the familiar process editor within Frends that most of you should probably be using. And the interesting bit here is that now actually Frends is taking all of the configuration that you provided here earlier and using that to generate what we're calling kind of a template for you to start development on. So you have your kind of API trigger here, which is now generated based on the different paths and the different options you provided for this particular API. And we also have the return node, which is also generating its configuration based on the responses field that we gave our API. So if you remember that we specified our API to be JSON, application JSON, you can see that that's there. You remember the data model that we specified. We have an example of our data model here. We have the correct HTTP status code. If we had specified some sort of HTTP headers or basically anything allowed by the HTTP protocol, all of that would be pre-configured for us here so that then we can follow along with our API development properly. And now pretty much the only thing that we need to do is specify what should happen in between of us receiving the API call here and us returning some data from here. And if our point here was to generate a date time API, well, I'm just going to drop a simple piece of, let's say, a code snippet here so that I can generate my actual date and time stamp. So I'm just going to call my and add a new variable called date time and say that my date time stamp is just basically getting date time now, let's say, to string, and the format I want to get should be matching the format that we're kind of pushing out from our APIs. So I'm just going to say that it's going to be year dash month dash day. So we should be ending up with a similar format that we're using here to return stuff out of our API. And that's pretty much it. So the only thing left to do is now take our date time variable that we have given the basically logic or configuration of where we should be getting that variable and injecting that variable here in the end result of our API. And here we do the kind of basic double curly bracket notation that we use in Frends. And now under the variables, we can actually access the date time. Whoops. We can access the date time variable that we provided in the first step here. And that's what we should be returning to our API consumer. And this is the kind of most simple use case. But now, of course, in real life, you would be doing SQL queries or passing the original API request to existing APIs, or you might be reading files from a local file system, or any of the basic integration functionality that you can do with Frends in more complicated scenarios. But for our demonstration purposes here, we're gonna be fairly happy with our assigned date and time here, and basically click create new process and activate it, and that will actually now create the backend for our date time API, and we can see that it's active and it's actually being hosted now in a cloud agent. And what that actually means is that now the get time operation has this link. So there's the linked process icon there saying that whenever this path of the API is being called, it's actually routing that request now to a specific Frends agent, to a specific version of the backend process that we just developed there. And that's going to be executing the API functionality in actuality and in practice. So now that we have our first API specification done, so we did our specification, we did our API backend development here. So we told our API, excuse me, what it should be doing when the API call comes in. That means that now our API would be consumable. So we can actually click the Swagger UI button, which we can of course also lock. So if I put on the lock for the Swagger UI button, I'm not actually allowed to view the specification. So if you want to hide your specification and only provide the specification for a set amount of people, you can kind of lock it behind a gated API key. So then you would be first required to authenticate or authorize yourself in order to actually call this API. But let's just leave it open for now. And we can actually go ahead in here. And this should be now exactly familiar or quite familiar with you, because the view that you would get from the Swagger UI button is now the representation of the API in real life. So when it's actually being deployed, in our case now here to a development agent, but we would be following the same logic that we do everywhere in Frends, where we might have test agents or development agent or production agents and so on. But the point here is that this is actually now a completely different server or a service than where we are doing the actual development. So the API is now actually in real life being hosted somewhere on another service or server than where we did the configuration to actually create the API. And now here in the Swagger UI, we have what's called the Try Now button. So we can just call the API and see what happens. So we press the execute button, and we can see that the server response for our API is actually the kind of array. Oh, actually, we didn't change the array to be just the object, but never mind that. So we have our array, which has a single object and with the property date and time. And that's now something that we generated on the fly using our code there on the API backend. And we also have some HTTP headers now for our API call. And this is pretty much the most simple case. So now I can just call my API fairly happy here and get the current date time. But now the next step, or the interesting bit, would be the monitoring aspect. So now that our API is live, we can actually go in and see that these are now the requests being sent to my API, and we can now actually jump in and see that, all right, what was my IP address when I called my API? I actually had I had an intercom session cookie there for me available, or all sorts of different HTTP headers that were used to do the API call. And the only thing that we did there was basically to generate our date timestamp, which we then used to create our end result that will then are being displayed here. So the date and time response from our API. And of course, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can do with monitoring, and there we have other webinars or documentation on how you should actually maybe enhance the monitoring experience a little bit and create different things that you want to promote from the API execution and so on. But for now, we're fairly happy with our example API being something that we can actually now consume and have been available for us. So the next step that we would actually now want to do is take our current API that we have here and secure that somehow. And the way that we're going to be doing that in our case here is fairly straightforward. So we're going to be applying an API key authorization to our API. And you can find a whole bunch of the information about the kind of authentication stuff, that how you are supposed to, and what are the different authentication options. And we are actually supporting all of the different options that of course, the specification is doing. But you can see that there's the API key sample is something that now we are interested in. And of course, you could be doing just the basic authentication with username and password. But what we're actually interested now is the API key sample. And I actually have a ready-made sample here, so we're going to be cheating a little bit here as well and just copy pasting the existing security specification here to our API. So now, similarly to how in our specification we have paths and we have definitions, we can add a third section called security definitions. And in our security definitions, we can now tell that we want to be using the API key definition, just like is defined here in our sample in our OpenAPI specification. But that alone actually isn't enough. So you can see that there's now the authorized button appeared here, but we haven't yet applied our API key authorization to any specific API, because if we did that, there would be a lock showing here that this API is something that needs to be authenticated to. Since we can have an API that has operations where some of the operations are behind an authorization or authentication, and some of them might be behind different authentication, and some of them might be completely non-authenticated, so you could just call them without any authentication. So we need to tell our API operation or path here that we want to use the API key authentication in this case. And the way that we actually do that is adding what's called this sort of a security element now to any path that we want to tell to be using our specific API authentication. So what we actually want to be doing here is telling that this particular API operation should actually have the security aspect there. And it's actually complaining to me a little bit about that security requirements must match a security definition. So if you remember in our security definition, we have our API key definition, but we don't have adventure auth definition. So we need to get rid of that. And now we should be completely fine. So what we did there is we told that we want to be using an API key, and the API key should be used to access this API operation to get the actual time. And at this point, we would be fairly happy. So we followed the specification, and it's really important that you follow the specification kind of to the letter in the case of the authentication and authorization models, since even a little bit of an error, so in this case, for example, the name needs to be API_key, and the type needs to be API capital key or capital K key. And if it's anything different, the specification isn't correct and it's not going to work. So you need to follow the specification quite directly in order to make everything work. But we would be fairly happy at this point. So let's just save our changes. And now actually, if you remember, once we started the talk here, we talked a little bit about having different API-based paths and trying to avoid breaking APIs or doing breaking changes to APIs. And we actually did a breaking change to our API here because we changed the way that the API can be accessed. So someone might be calling our API happily with no authentication, and suddenly we introduced authentication. So their application will now break because it's different from what we did with our API. So what we actually need to be doing here is telling the API that we are changing now the authorization model to go towards the API key authentication. So what we actually want to do is click the unlink process there. So we still have our existing API available. So if I link it back, we are still able to call our API because we prevented you from making that breaking change. So what we need to do is actually unlink our API and create a new linked API. So now we are replacing the existing function. And here you can see that the authorization is actually the same thing or from our existing API. And another way that we could do this if we wanted to is actually take our date and time API. Let's link it back to our existing API. We could go in our API and add a new API trigger here and tell that actually, yeah, we want to now take our date time API there and get the kind of refreshed version. So we're actually replacing the trigger. So we're intentionally making the change or basically intentionally making the breaking change here. And that always making the breaking change always requires you to actually generate a new version of the API backend so that then we can have the kind of audit trail and the linking of who actually did what. So if I now go back in here and check what's the difference between these two versions, I can see that between version 0.1.1 and 0.1.2, we actually changed the API description here. So we replaced it with another specification. But now that we've actually kind of intentionally made our breaking change here to our API, and if we try to call our API again, we get an error saying that authorization header did not contain API key. So what we should be doing next is actually generating an API key to allow access to our API that we can then use to actually get the API consume or consume our API in this use case. So let's just call our new API key here get, let's call it time. Our time key is completely good enough. You can specify in which environment the API key is going to be linked to. The key will be actually generated for you when you save the API key. So I'm going to save it. And now I should have my API key here, but I still don't have any API rule set applied there. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and in the API rule set sections and specify an API rule to allow access to date time API. And I'm just going to be saying that I want to allow every operation in our date time or get time API here, and I want my time key to be applied to this API rule. So that means that now with my brand new API key, I would be able to go back in our API portal here, authorize myself with my API key, and now consume the API exactly like before. So I'm able to get my response back here and be fairly happy with it. And just to give you guys a brief demonstration here, previously, of course, we were anonymous, but now we can identify ourselves with the time key that we just generated for our API key here. And this is something that now we can use to track the API usage here between different APIs and all of that stuff. But now we've kind of gone through all the steps of actually creating a brand new API and securing that API. The only thing left to do is actually, if you have multiple different Frends environments, so usually you would have development, test, and production, we can now actually take the whole API and deploy the whole API as a whole to, let's say, our test environment. And we're also able to actually tweak what versions of the different API we want to include in this deployment. So if we click the deploy and activate triggers, that means that now in the cloud environment or the test environment, we should be able to have our get time API available here. So we have exactly the same API now deployed to the test environment. And the interesting thing here is that if you check that here we are consuming it from a development agent perspective, and if we now go to our cloud test environment and try and consume our API, we are taking to a different server or service altogether. And now the whole idea here is that we can go through the familiar development test production pipeline to manage our API and do changes and build the lifecycle management of the API system as a whole, using the deployment, the different environment functionality there. So just to recap a little bit here before we actually, I'm quite terrified of the time. It took way longer than I thought to actually go through the tough stuff, but I'd still like to go through the kind of AdventureWorks example like we did discuss there earlier a little bit. But pretty much what we did here is did our API specification. We specified the basic information for our API. We did the API definition, and then we introduced our first API operation, where we actually then configured what our API should be doing in the backend. And then we finally applied the security definition or the authentication using an API key. And we created the API key, or we generated the API key that we can use. And we created that rule set that allows access to our datetime API here. And you should definitely go ahead and check out documentation for all the needs and bits on how to do everything properly there. But maybe finally here, just a brief example of something maybe a little bit more complicated. So here we have an API specification for the product list, which is actually getting data from a database. So what we have here are two different API operations. One where we can get a kind of a complete list of all the products that we have listed in our AdventureWorks database. And then we have another one to get the product information for a specific product. So as you can see, the previous API here only has the name and product category and the product ID. So now we can actually use our information from our first API call, which is open for everyone, and try and get the information for a specific product. But you can still see here, okay, so we're getting the error 104 unauthorized. So we actually need to authorize ourselves to this API. And in this case, what we're using is actually OAuth 2 and the implicit flow to authorize ourselves to the API. And we're telling here that we're using we're using an Auth0 service to provide us with the authorization and basically the login experience. And you could use Azure Active Directory, Google Cloud, Facebook, whatever, to do the specification here. There are many different examples, and I'm going to say that my client ID is going to be that. So that this is something that you need to register here on your identity providers or basically login experiences side. And I'm going to say that I want my login to include write products here, or actually, let's say, read products scope. I'm going to click authorize. So now I'm taken into the basically login of my service provider of choice. And I'm just going to log in here. And it's going to be saying that, okay, so it took me back now to my authorization, and basically the login was successful, because now you can see that the lock is actually closed. And if I now execute my API call, you can see that, all right, so here we can actually get the specific information for this particular API. But the interesting bit here is that if we actually go ahead in here and check out the call to my API, so this was my API call here to my, or what we actually clicked here from the UI previously, you can see that we're actually now using some of the information from our API call, so from the authentication. So we're using the read product scope, if you remember how we clicked that we wanted to have the read product scope available for us. So we are using that as a way of actually modifying the back end of our API. So what do we actually have here are two different SQL queries that we're getting data from an SQL database and then returning that to the consumer. So we're actually checking if the user has that scope read products available. We're actually providing a much larger set of data than if they don't have that read product scope available. So actually, if we do the same thing again here, but actually tap write products instead of read products. So we could of course do both, but if we only go for write products and authorize ourselves again, so we need to now log in again, because we are changing basically our credential information. So I'm logging in here again. And if we do exactly the same API call here, but with different information in our API scope, or basically in our token, we can see that we actually get a much kind of a stricter version of the data. So this is now actually something that you can use within Frends. No, actually not that one. We probably need to refresh here. We can use that information contained within the JWT token here. So we're actually the open API specification, and the OAuth 2 used there is using JWT tokens to do the authorization. And I won't go into that much detail on what all of this entails, but basically it means that we have all of this information available for us regarding the identity who is using our API, and we can use that information to our advantage here. So we can check, do they have specific claims, for example, and if they don't, we can do something different. Or we could, for example, pick up, let's say, an organization unit here and use that to limit access to only the data that belongs to this user, and only display that to the API consumer, and all of this cool stuff that we can do with the API identity available for us here regarding this point, or this method of using and building APIs. All right. Unfortunately, we kind of are all out of time. 1 hour went by way faster than I expected this time around. But let me just actually do a little bit of advertising here in the end. So you might be left wondering a little bit about how the kind of OAuth authentication and the kind of, let's say, authorizing way APIs and everything of that sort works. You can actually go ahead into our documentation, and we did the 3rd webinar about modernizing legacy systems with an integration layer. And in this webinar, what we're actually doing is going really into detail on how we're using the identity and how we're doing kind of the more advanced API stuff and using the different API policies and keys together to limit access and do rate throttling and all of that kind of more complicated things relating now to Frends API. So I highly encourage everyone to actually take a look at the webinar there. And just finally, I just wanted to let everyone kind of know here, or let everyone hear just a little bit, or do a little bit of advertising here as well, since pretty much what we're doing, or actually wait just a moment here. I hope that everyone has actually, or everyone should know that we are actually now hosting a Frends event on the 5th of September. Which is going to be pretty large, and we're going to have nice speakers there from Lähitaksi case, where we did an API specification there, or a complete API project. We're going to be having a large polytechnic university in Finland explaining how they built APIs on their own using Frends, and just a whole bunch of nice customers and people to talk with and do some networking. So we're going to be sending kind of a registration link to everyone who was in the webinar afterwards, and I highly hope that anyone can make it to the Frends Day that we're hosting, if at all possible. But that's it for me. We are overdue for 1 minute. Hopefully this was at least somewhat informative and interesting, and definitely go check out the other webinar, so basically the webinar 3, for more in-depth stuff about how the API authentication and authorization side works within Frends. But that's it for me this time. So thanks everyone so much for joining, and join us for the next round of Frends webinars, which should be kind of coming around in a month or so. So everyone have a great day, and bye-bye.